It started when I moved into my grandfather's old house. The place had been sitting empty for years after he passed, a lonely structure at the edge of town, surrounded by nothing but overgrown fields and dense woodland. No one in my family wanted it. They spoke of it in hushed tones, as if even mentioning it too often would bring something unpleasant back to the surface. But when the will was read, the house was mine. I was young, broke, and in need of a fresh start. A free house seemed like a miracle, but as soon as I stepped inside, something felt wrong. At first, I chalked it up to age. The house was old, its wooden floors creaking under my weight, the walls lined with peeling wallpaper that held the scent of dust and forgotten memories. There were rooms filled with objects left behind, things my grandfather never threw away. He had been a collector of strange artifacts, and each room was packed with odd trinkets, antique books, and things that looked out of place. But the strangest thing by far was the basement. The door to it was heavy, made of thick oak with a tarnished brass handle. It was locked when I arrived, and I didn't have a key. I figured I'd find it eventually, or maybe the lock had rusted shut over the years. Either way, I wasn't in a hurry to go down there. I had more important things to focus on, like making the house feel livable. Then, on my third night in the house, I found the key. I wasn't looking for it. In fact, I was just clearing out one of the storage closets in the hallway when I knocked over an old wooden box. Its lid popped open on impact, and inside, nestled among old letters and dusty photographs, was a key. It was large, old-fashioned, and covered in rust. Its jagged teeth were uneven, and it looked like it had been used 100 times before. As soon as I touched it, a chill ran through my entire body. I hesitated, holding the key in my palm, staring at it with a strange sense of dread. Something about it felt wrong. My gut told me to put it back, to forget about it, but I couldn't shake the thought of the locked basement door. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was just the house playing tricks on me. But that night, as I lay in bed, I could hear something, a faint scratching sound, coming from beneath the floorboards. It was coming from the basement, and suddenly, I knew I was never supposed to unlock that door. The scratching didn't stop. I lay in bed, gripping the sheets, my breath shallow as the sound crept through the silence of the house. It was faint, almost like nails dragging along wood, slow, deliberate, waiting. I told myself it was just an animal, a raccoon maybe, or rats. Old houses had pests, right? But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The sound wasn't frantic or aimless like a trapped rodent. It was rhythmic, purposeful, like something wanted me to hear it. I forced myself to ignore it, turning on my side, squeezing my eyes shut. If I let my mind run wild, I'd never sleep. But just as I started to drift off, I heard it again, louder. My eyes snapped open, my body rigid with fear. This time, the sound wasn't coming from below me. It was coming from just beyond my bedroom door, the hallway. I sat up slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The house was dark, only the faint glow of the moon slipping through the cracked blinds. I strained my ears, waiting, listening. The scratching continued, now closer, right outside my door. I held my breath. Then, silence. I exhaled shakily, forcing myself to move. My bare feet hit the cold wooden floor as I stood up, moving toward the door as quietly as I could. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct in me screamed to stay in bed, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. but I had to check. I had to be sure I wasn't imagining things. With trembling fingers, I turned the doorknob and pulled the door open just an inch, just enough to peek out. Nothing. The hallway was empty. The dim light from the old chandelier barely reached the edges of the corridor. The house was silent again, as if nothing had happened. But I could feel it, that wrongness hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. I looked toward the basement door at the end of the hallway. It was still locked. The key sat on my nightstand, untouched. And yet, something inside me whispered that whatever was making that sound, whatever was waiting, was already aware of the key. I swallowed hard and shut my door, locking it. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, the logical part of my brain tried to convince me I had dreamed the whole thing. Sleep deprivation, overactive imagination. It made sense. But then I went downstairs and I saw the deep, jagged scratch marks running down the length of the basement door. Something had been trying to get out. I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, staring at the basement door. My throat was dry, my body unwilling to move any closer. The scratch marks ran deep, gouging the wood in long, jagged streaks. Something had tried to get out. I wanted to believe there was a rational explanation, that maybe the marks had always been there and I'd just never noticed them. But deep down, I knew better. They were fresh. The edges of the wood were raw, splintered. I ran my fingers lightly over them, and a deep shudder ran down my spine. The grooves weren't random, like an animal clawing in desperation. They were methodical, precise. Whatever had made them hadn't been panicked, it had been patient. I backed away, my pulse hammering. The key still sat on my nightstand upstairs, untouched. But even now, I felt it calling to me, like it was tethered to the door. I needed to get rid of it. I turned on my heel and hurried back upstairs. The morning light did little to ease the growing unease in my chest. The house felt colder now, like something had seeped into the walls overnight. I grabbed the key, its rusted surface rough against my palm, and made my way outside. Standing in the overgrown backyard, I felt ridiculous. It was just a key, a stupid, old key. Yet, the weight of it in my hand felt wrong, like I was holding something that wasn't meant to be here. I clenched my fist around it, took a deep breath, and threw it as far as I could into the woods behind the house. The key disappeared into the thicket, swallowed by the trees and brush. I exhaled sharply, wiping my hands against my jeans as if that would shake off the feeling that clung to me. That's it, I told myself. It's over. But it wasn't. That night, the scratching came back. It was louder this time, angrier. I buried my head under my pillow, willing myself not to listen, but it was impossible to ignore. The sound scraped against my nerves, dragging long and deliberate against the basement door. I shut my eyes tighter. Then, the doorknob rattled. I bolted upright in bed, my breath catching in my throat. My ears strained against the silence that followed. Then, a single, slow knock. I clenched my blanket, barely breathing. Then, another, and another. Knock, knock, knock. Slow, patient. Then the voice came, whispering through the wood. You shouldn't have thrown it away. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The whisper had slithered through the wood, curling around my spine like cold fingers. The words echoed in my skull, low and deliberate. You shouldn't have thrown it away. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the blanket so tightly, my knuckles turned white. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe this was sleep paralysis, a trick of my exhausted mind. Then, knock. the same slow, rhythmic knocking as before. I turned my head toward my bedroom door, half expecting to see it opening on its own, but it was shut, locked. I swallowed hard, my throat painfully dry. The sound wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from downstairs, from the basement door. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there, waiting for whatever it was to come inside. Slowly, I forced myself out of bed, my legs weak beneath me. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I made my way to the top of the stairs, heart pounding. The knocking had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. I reached the bottom step and turned the corner, bracing myself. The basement door was still closed, but something was different. Something was wrong. My eyes locked onto the floor in front of the basement. The key, the same rusty key I had thrown into the woods hours ago. It sat there, motionless, as if someone or something had placed it there carefully, waiting for me to find it. The sight of it made my stomach churn. No, this wasn't possible. I bent down slowly, hesitating before reaching out. The key was warm in my hand. Not just warm, hot, like it had been sitting under the sun all day. A sudden dizziness washed over me as I touched it, my vision flickering for just a second. For that brief moment, I wasn't in the house anymore. I was somewhere else, a dark, cramped space. The walls were damp stone, the air thick and suffocating. My breathing echoed in the stillness. I couldn't move, couldn't see beyond the shadows. And then, just as quickly as it happened, I was back. The key was still in my hand. My head spun as I staggered backward, my breath ragged. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing for certain. The key had come back to me. It wanted to be used. And something on the other side of that basement door was waiting. I stared at the key in my palm, my fingers trembling. It was impossible. I had thrown it deep into the woods, watched it vanish into the underbrush. And yet, here it was, lying at my feet like a stray dog that had found its way home. It wanted me to use it. A deep, crawling unease settled into my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to walk away, to never set foot near that basement door again. But I knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. I had let something in. I tightened my grip around the key and turned toward the basement door. The scratch marks on the wood seemed deeper than before, the jagged grooves like claw marks carved into flesh. The air around the door was different too, thicker, colder, expectant. My pulse pounded in my ears as I lifted the key to the lock. My hand hesitated just inches away, shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. I could still walk away. I could throw the key into the fireplace, burn it, never look back. But before I could make my decision, the door unlocked itself. A slow, clicking noise echoed in the silence, metal grinding against metal. My breath caught in my throat as the lock turned without my hand even touching it. The key was still in my grasp, but the door had opened on its own. The air in the house shifted. It was subtle, like a distant, unseen breath exhaled into the room. The house felt wrong, as if I was no longer alone. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as I pushed the door open just an inch. The basement was dark. Not the kind of darkness you get when the lights are off, but a deep, endless black that seemed to stretch far beyond what should have been possible. My flashlight barely cut through it, swallowed by the void beyond the first few steps. The air smelled damp, like earth and old stone. But underneath that was something else, something rotting. I shouldn't go down there. Every bone in my body knew it. But something moved in the darkness below, a shuffling sound, slow and deliberate, and then a whisper. It was faint, like breath against my ear, but it came from the basement. It wasn't my voice, but it spoke my name. Come down. The house was silent. The walls seemed to press inward, the air thick with something ancient and unseen. I took a step back. I needed to run. I needed to close the door, now. But before I could move, something knocked from the inside of the basement. Once, twice, 3 times. Knock, knock, knock. And then the door swung open, wide. The door swung open, its movement smooth and unnerving, like it was eager to reveal something hidden in the shadows. I stood frozen, staring down into the blackness, my heartbeat drumming in my chest. The air that poured out from the basement was thick, heavy, with a damp, musty smell that clung to my skin. The knock had stopped, but the feeling of being watched intensified. Something was down there. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, clawing at me from the darkness. The flicker of my flashlight seemed weak against the consuming blackness ahead, barely penetrating the first few steps. I glanced around the hallway, half expecting someone to appear, someone who could explain this. But there was no one. I took another step toward the door. The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't a soft, coaxing sound. It was sharper, more urgent. Come down. I didn't want to. I didn't want to step any closer, but it felt like something was pulling me, compelling me. The flashlight trembled in my hand and the beam wavered across the stairs that led into the basement. They were steep, narrow, and dark, too dark. I couldn't see what lay at the bottom. What if there was something down there waiting? Something that had been waiting for me? But there was no turning back. Not now. Not after the door had opened on its own, after the knocks, after the whispers. I had to know. I took a slow, deliberate step onto the first stair. The moment my foot made contact with the wood, the air seemed to shift. Heavy, thick, like I was pushing through water. The stair creaked under my weight, and the darkness around me seemed to pulse, as though it was alive, as though it was reacting to my presence. I descended one step at a time, each one seeming to take me farther away from the world I knew. The smell of decay grew stronger, more suffocating, until it filled my nostrils with a rancid, sour taste that almost made me gag. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, the darkness below seemed to shift. I blinked. My eyes strained to focus in the dim light. Was there something moving in the shadows? It was quick, but I saw it. A shape, a figure, shifting in the corner of the basement. My heart skipped a beat, and I stumbled backward, my breath quickening. My mind screamed at me to turn and run, but my body was frozen in place. It wasn't just the figure I saw, though. It was the feeling that followed it. A sense of overwhelming wrongness, like the very air around me had twisted, something ancient and powerful stirring below, something that shouldn't have existed, something that was never meant to be disturbed. I forced myself to take another step, and then, without warning, the flashlight blinked out completely, and the basement was swallowed in complete darkness. And then I heard it, the sound of breathing. It wasn't mine. It wasn't human. It was deep, labored, and coming from the bottom of the stairs. The air grew colder the moment the flashlight went out, and my heart raced with a primal fear I hadn't felt in years. The darkness was complete now. My eyes had adjusted to the dim light that had been cast by the torch. But now, with it gone, there was nothing. I felt the oppressive weight of the basement pressing in on me, 1,000 unseen forces closing in, and I was standing in the middle of it, utterly exposed. The breathing came again, deep, slow, deliberate. It was like the sound of someone, or something, taking in a deep, shuddering breath, and then releasing it with a wheeze that vibrated through the floorboards beneath my feet. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The sheer volume, the guttural quality of the sound rattled my bones. I could feel it rising from the depths of the basement, thickening the air, surrounding me, pressing down. Whatever was down there, I was certain it knew I was there. I wanted to turn around. I wanted to run up the stairs and lock the basement door, leaving whatever it was down there to remain in its dark, forgotten corner. But my body refused to obey. My feet were stuck to the floor, my legs trembling with fear, as though the basement itself was holding me in place. The breathing stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. The oppressive air seemed to thicken even more, pushing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. I could hear nothing but the pounding of my heart. I thought I heard movement, soft scraping sounds that didn't come from the floor or the walls, but from the very darkness itself. The silence after the breathing was worse than before, like the air was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then, a soft scraping sound came from the far side of the basement, followed by a low, almost imperceptible whisper, "Come closer." I froze, the voice a chilling command that shot through me, paralyzing me further. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the darkness itself or if it was in my head. Either way, it felt like the darkness had spoken. "Please, no," I whispered, the words slipping from my mouth before I could stop them. My voice, barely audible, seemed to vanish into the air, swallowed by the cold that surrounded me. I turned my head, desperate to see something, anything, but the blackness was impenetrable. There was no shape, no form, only that feeling, that pull. I could feel it again, the presence. Whatever was down there, whatever was breathing in the dark, was coming closer. Slowly, deliberately, it was moving toward me, the air heavy with its advance. The whisper came again, this time louder, more distinct. "You can't leave." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The voice wasn't just in my ears. It was inside my skull, inside my thoughts. I could feel it. Whatever it wasn't bound by space or time. It was the darkness, and it was already inside me. I stumbled backward, but my legs betrayed me. I fell, crashing onto the cold concrete floor. The breath in my chest caught as the heavy darkness seemed to press down harder, as if it were consuming me. I had to escape, but something told me it was already too late. I scrambled backward, my hands and knees scraping against the cold concrete floor. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat loud and erratic, threatening to break free from my ribcage. The basement seemed to stretch around me, the darkness expanding, the air thick with the suffocating presence that was closing in from all sides. I reached out blindly, trying to find the stairs, but my hand brushed against nothing but empty air. The voice came again, the same low, rasping whisper that seemed to slither through the room. "You cannot leave." I froze. The words were like daggers, piercing through the ever-growing panic in my mind. My breath hitched as I strained to listen, trying to pinpoint where the voice had come from. but it felt like it was everywhere at once, surrounding me in the thick, oppressive dark. I wasn't alone anymore. The feeling had intensified, but this time I could sense something else. Movement. I glanced up into the darkness, my eyes struggling to adjust to the void around me. The flashlight, now dead in my hand, offered no help. But then, there, just beyond the shadows, eyes. At first, it was just a pair of pinpricks of light flickering like distant stars. But as I focused, they grew brighter, more distinct. Two glowing orbs, their shape inhuman, staring at me from across the room. The darkness around them seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, feeding off the gaze they cast. The eyes didn't blink. They didn't move. They just watched. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was seeing. They weren't human eyes. They couldn't be. The pupils were too wide, too large, and the irises, if you could even call them that, seemed to ripple like oil on water, shifting with an unnatural fluidity. The eyes moved, not as if they were tracking me, but like they were alive, aware. I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, stuck in place as the eyes slowly narrowed, almost as though they were judging me. They blinked once, slowly, and the darkness around me seemed to deepen, the weight of it pressing down harder, suffocating me. I could feel the presence moving closer, the eyes never leaving me. I wanted to look away. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. The pull of those eyes was like a magnet, drawing me in. The whisper came again, this time clearer, its voice a low, guttural growl that rumbled in the pit of my stomach. You are here now. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I wasn't alone anymore. I was being watched. But it wasn't just by the eyes. It was something behind them, something that had been hiding in the shadows, waiting for me to stumble into its domain. And now, I had nowhere to run. The darkness seemed to pulse, vibrating in rhythm with the glowing eyes that now filled my entire vision. The room had become a prison, the walls closing in, and the oppressive air around me felt like it was suffocating me, choking out my breath. The eyes, their unnatural glow, was all I could see now. I could feel them in my head, in my very thoughts, drawing closer with each passing second. It was as if the room was no longer real, and I had become part of the void, part of the space between the shadows. You are here now. The whisper was so much louder this time. It wasn't just in my ears. It was inside my mind, reverberating through every cell in my body. I could feel it spreading like cold tendrils, burrowing into my thoughts. The voice wasn't a human voice, but it was somehow familiar, deep, and ancient, like it had been waiting for me to hear it. I stumbled backward, trying to break free from the pull of the eyes, but the darkness wrapped around me, as if it were a tangible thing, like it had a grip on me that I couldn't escape. My feet felt heavy, like they were sinking into the floor, and I could feel the floorboards beneath me creaking, as if the house itself were alive, reacting to the presence in the room. The eyes blinked again, and with that blink, I felt a sudden shift. It was as though the world around me had bent, twisted. The air felt thicker, heavier, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. I could feel the presence pressing in from all sides, suffocating me, drowning out everything. The air was stale with the smell of damp earth and rotting wood. But underneath that, there was something more, something foul, like a decaying presence that had been festering in the dark for years. The figure in the shadows, the one whose eyes I had been staring into, finally moved. Its shape was formless at first, just a silhouette in the corner of the room. But as it drew closer, I saw it more clearly. Its body was tall, thin, its limbs unnaturally long and stretched. It didn't have a face, not one that I could make sense of. The darkness around it shifted and swirled, making it seem like the figure was more a part of the room than a physical being. "You've been drawn to it," the voice said again, its tone becoming more insistent, more commanding. "The door has opened, and you've crossed into our world." The words were a shock, a cold wave crashing over me. I could feel the weight of them, their meaning sinking in, and I realized with growing horror that I had been led here. This wasn't just a random encounter. I had been drawn to this place, to this moment, by something much darker, much older, and I had stepped into a world that didn't belong to me. The figure stepped forward again, and this time I could feel its presence in my bones, in my soul. The darkness was alive, and I was its next victim. The figure moved closer, and as it did, the shadows seemed to fold around it, blending with its form, until it was indistinguishable from the darkness itself. I could no longer tell where the figure ended and the room began. My senses were drowning in the overwhelming presence, the oppressive energy that seeped into every inch of the space. The air felt colder now, too cold. It was as though the very temperature had dropped by degrees, as if the room had been carved out of ice, its very essence frozen in time. I felt the chill seeping into my bones, into my soul, and with it came a heavy sense of inevitability. The whispering voices grew louder, now thundering inside my head. The words were distorted, overlapping, becoming one continuous oppressive hum that thrummed through every fiber of my being. "You cannot escape." The voice from the figure echoed again, but this time it wasn't just a voice. It was everywhere. Inside my thoughts, inside the walls of the room, inside me. "You are ours now. You opened the door. You belong to the hollow." I tried to fight it. My body screamed in protest, every instinct telling me to run, to flee, to escape the suffocating weight of the darkness closing in around me. But my legs were heavy, like lead, and the space around me seemed to grow smaller with each passing moment. The very air felt sticky, clinging to my skin, suffocating me. I could feel it now, deep inside, the hollow. It was alive. It was in me. My thoughts, my memories, they were no longer mine to control. The figure's presence, the voices, the darkness, they had claimed me. I was no longer a person. I had become part of this thing, this void, this endless, consuming force that had waited for me to open the door. "You will never be the same again," the voice whispered, as though it were savoring each word. "The hollow is inside you now. The mask has claimed you, and it will never let you go." My mind was no longer my own. I felt as if I was being torn apart from the inside, my sense of self unraveling like a thread caught in the wind. There was nothing left of me. The figure in front of me, its hollow eyes staring down at me, was no longer a stranger. It was me. It had always been me. The mask had found me, claimed me, and now I was part of it. I reached out, but my hands were trembling, my fingers too weak to grasp anything. There was nothing left to hold on to. The room around me continued to shift, the darkness closing in until it felt like there was no world beyond it, just me and the hollow and the endless void. And then there was nothing. The darkness swallowed everything. I was lost to it.